Why was she the only one not laughing at the briefing table? They had cracked jokes about cold rations, about the snow that turned boots into blocks of ice, about how the Germans were running on fumes now. Every man seemed certain this would be another pushback, another routine slog. But she sat silent, fingers tightening around the pencil she wasn't even using. Because she knew something they didn't. Evelyn Hayes, 27, a war nobody expected her to fight, had dragged her from a classroom in Vermont to the front lines of Belgium. She wasn't supposed to be here. Women weren't forward observers, not officially. But paper shuffling had never won wars. Quiet competence had. She was the shadow in the room, the one generals trusted when maps didn't tell the whole story. And now she was holding a secret that gnawed at her every breath. They thought this was going to be another bombardment, another routine artillery curtain to scatter the enemy before infantry moved. But Evelyn knew the shells coming in today were unlike anything fired before in Europe. She had sat through the testing reports. She had read the briefings stamped with red, restricted, and absolutely no foreign disclosure. She had watched one detonate over a practice field in Maryland, shrapnel scything downwards in a cone that ripped dummies apart with surgical precision. She had been told to observe, to record, to say nothing. But how do you sit among men laughing about how their foxholes would hold, knowing their doctrine, their years of survival instincts, meant nothing now? She pressed the pencil harder against the table. It broke in half. No one noticed. Outside, dawn staggered across the Ardennes, gray and merciless. Snow crusted the trees like bone. Somewhere in that frozen labyrinth, German infantry crouched in neat foxhole rows, their breath clouding in the mist. Evelyn pictured them as she had been trained, coordinates on a grid, numbers in a firing solution. But another part of her, the part that still heard her father's sermons on Sundays back home, saw something else. Faces. Men who had survived Stalingrad, Kursk, a dozen battles where Earth itself had been their shield. They would be telling each other the same thing right now. Stay low. The overhead cover will hold. It always holds. They didn't know. The clock ticked, 600 hours. A distant thunder rose, steady, methodical. The American howitzers of the 7th Field Artillery Battalion began their morning song. Evelyn felt it through her boots, through her chest. She leaned forward, binoculars pressed to her face, sighting over the frost-tipped ridge where scouts swore German formations had dug in. The first shell streaked upward, vanishing into fog. She followed its invisible arc, breath caught. She wanted to tell the men crouched in foxholes miles away, don't trust the earth above you. Don't believe the rules you've memorized. Run. Scatter. Save yourselves. But silence was the price of the mission. A white flash tore the sky. Not the muffled thud of a ground burst. Not the familiar percussion soldiers had trained their ears to parse. This was sharper, cleaner, a whipcrack from above. Evelyn flinched at the sound even though she had expected it. Airburst 30 feet overhead, right on schedule. Through the glass she saw trees shudder as shrapnel whined downward. Snow cascaded from branches in heavy sheets. She didn't need to see the men to know. Foxholes that had sheltered lives for years were now coffins. Her throat tightened. She forced herself to mark the impact grid in her notebook, hands steady though her stomach churned. The second shell followed, brighter, closer. She heard the overpressure even from her position, a pressure wave that punched air from her lungs, and then a third, then a fourth. The horizon lit in cold fire. Voices rose on the radio. On target, fire for effect. She wrote the words mechanically, a clerk of death. For 18 minutes the forest convulsed. Each crack overhead delivered fragments moving faster than sight, punching through timber, earth, bone. She remembered the Aberdeen trials. 5 times the lethality of a ground burst, the engineers had said proudly. And here it was, proving them right. When the barrage eased, silence rushed back too quickly. Not silence, just the wrong kind of sound. Distant cries, shouts muddled by fog, the thin wail of someone who hadn't died quickly. Evelyn lowered her binoculars. She realized her hands were trembling now. She wasn't supposed to feel it this much. She was supposed to be the calm observer, the professional analyst. She had trained herself for this. Intelligence was about clarity, not conscience. But nothing in her training accounted for the moment when theory becomes human. The infantry captain beside her muttered something about beautiful work. He saw only the neat geometry of a mission accomplished. She turned her face away before he noticed the glassiness in her eyes. Was this beautiful? Was this what victory sounded like? Somewhere in that fog, a German squad leader, maybe 30 yards from one of those foxholes, was realizing what she already knew, that the old rules of survival had collapsed, that every instinct, every scar-earned lesson meant nothing against technology born in labs far away. Evelyn closed her notebook. She felt a hollow grow in her chest, not guilt exactly, not pride either, something heavier without a name. She told herself it was necessary. She told herself that if Germany's offensive wasn't broken here, more towns would burn, more children would starve, that these shells might shorten the war by months, maybe years. But another thought pressed against her ribs. No foxhole could protect them anymore. Not theirs, not ours. She stared into the fog where echoes still lingered. And for the first time since the war began, she wondered, had they opened a door they couldn't close? How do you measure silence after fire? The forest was still trembling when Evelyn lowered her binoculars again. Smoke smeared the ridgelines like bruises, curling upward through broken trees. Snow, once pristine, now lay pitted with black scars and fragments of iron. Somewhere beneath that scarred crust were men who had believed the earth would save them. She should have felt triumph. The others did. The infantry captain next to her grinned, muttering about how this would soften the bastards before the main push. Another officer scribbled casualty estimates on a clipboard as if they were scores in a game. Evelyn forced herself to nod, to look professional, to wear the mask of detachment she had spent 2 years perfecting. But behind her still face, the echoes were louder than the explosions had been. She remembered the young German soldier she'd glimpsed through binoculars the day before, no more than 19, shuffling nervously as he carried rations to a dugout. She had noted his position, reported it to fire control, filed him as part of a target cluster. Was he beneath one of those bursts now? Did he even have time to know what killed him? She clenched her jaw and wrote another line in her notebook. Coordinates, salvo count, casualty probability, numbers that carried no blood on the page, though she knew better. The radio crackled, target neutralized, awaiting further instructions. Her commanding officer gave a curt nod. We'll move forward, prep to link with scouts. Evelyn swallowed hard, adjusted her cap, and followed. Snow crunched beneath her boots as she trailed the column of men weaving through skeletal trees. Every step seemed louder than it should, as if the earth itself disapproved of their intrusion. She kept her eyes forward, refusing to glance back at the smoke still curling from where the foxholes had been. No one knew she had seen this before. That was the secret she carried heavier than her pack. Months earlier, in a testing ground stateside, she had been flown in under cover of administrative assignment. She had stood at the edge of a barren field while engineers cheered at the neatness of death descending from the sky. Wooden mannequins shredded, steel plates punctured. She had listened to them talk of efficiency, of exponential lethality. She had signed the non-disclosure agreements, and she had told herself she could compartmentalize. But now the field wasn't empty. Now it was filled with men digging in, laughing nervously, clutching their rifles like talismans. Now it was filled with boys who thought survival meant knowing when to duck. She adjusted her pack straps and tried not to think about it. The patrol reached a ridge where the forest broke into open ground. Evelyn crouched low, heart hammering. Across the expanse, faint shapes stirred, German survivors scattered, disoriented. Some staggered aimlessly, hands pressed to wounds. Others clung to shattered trees, searching for orders that would never come. The American captain motioned to his men. "Advance by fire teams. Secure the field." Evelyn stayed prone, binoculars raised. She forced herself into her role, observer, recorder, analyst. Her breath clouded the glass as she tracked movements. A group of Germans crawling toward a ravine, another limping along a hedgerow, one man dragging another who no longer moved. For a moment she thought of shouting, "Leave them, they're finished, they're no threat." But the silence returned, thick as snow. Gunfire rattled as the Americans pushed forward, shots echoing sharp and final. Evelyn kept watching, kept writing. Every word in her notebook a mask against what her heart wanted to scream. The ravine drew her eye again, survivors slipping down into its cover. A squad leader waved them deeper. Smart. He knew the foxholes were no longer safety. He had adapted already. Evelyn felt a strange, reluctant admiration. In another life, he might have been one of theirs. The radio hissed. "Adjust fire, new grid coordinates, ravine sector." Her hand froze above the paper. Ravine, the very place she had just marked. The survivors had minutes, maybe less. She wanted to throw the radio into the snow, to smash it beneath her boot. Instead, she wrote the line cleanly in her log, handed it over with steady fingers. "Confirmed," came the reply from artillery. She lowered her head, eyes closing. The second storm came fast. Crack after crack overhead, shrapnel raining down the steep banks. The ravine filled with soundless screams. Evelyn didn't need to watch. She didn't want to, but her duty chained her eyes open, forced her to witness. She marked the impacts with robotic precision. Another silence followed, not relief, not peace, only emptiness. The squad pressed forward again, rifles sweeping the ruins. Evelyn trailed behind, her notebook heavier than iron. That night in a makeshift command post lit by lanterns, she sat apart from the others. Men smoked, laughed too loudly, replayed stories of the day. "They didn't know what hit them," one soldier said, chuckling. "Just sitting ducks in those holes. It was over before it began." She stared at her hands. They looked pale, almost foreign. She had scrubbed them with snow until her skin burned, as if that could wash away the stains she couldn't see. "Hayes," the captain called. "Good eyes today, keep it up." She nodded without speaking. Inside, something knotted tighter. Later, alone in her cot, she pulled a letter from her pack, her mother's handwriting soft and looping. "We're so proud of you. Stay safe. Remember, Evelyn, you were born for something more than war." She pressed the letter to her chest, eyes burning. Something more than war. But what if war was all she had left? The lantern flickered. Wind rattled the tent walls. Evelyn lay awake, hearing again the whipcrack of airbursts, seeing again the ravine filling with fragments, wondering if silence would ever feel clean again. And beneath it all, one thought refused to fade. What if the real enemy wasn't the men in those foxholes, but the very weapon she had helped unleash? Why did they look at her like she didn't belong? The next morning, frost clung to the tents like armor. Men shuffled in heavy coats, their rifles slung, their breath steaming in clouds. Evelyn pulled her hood tighter, keeping her face shadowed, but she felt the stares. They never said it outright, not to her face, but she knew. She was the woman who didn't fit here, the one who wrote in notebooks instead of carrying a rifle, the one who listened more than she spoke. They respected her reports, her coordinates, her accuracy, but they didn't trust her, not fully, not when bullets cracked and shells fell, and maybe they were right not to. She wasn't one of them. "Orders came down," the captain announced, unfolding a damp paper. "We're advancing with 2nd Division. Forward observers stay tight. Hayes, you're with me." Evelyn nodded, tightening the strap on her satchel. The weight of her notebook seemed heavier with every step. They moved before dawn. The forest groaned in the cold, branches snapping under snow. Evelyn followed close behind, each step sinking into the crust, her heart packing ahead of her body. She kept her eyes on the men's backs, pretending their certainty could shield her. But nothing shielded her thoughts. Everywhere she looked, She saw ghosts of the day before. Foxholes filled not with soldiers but with absence. Ravines echoing with silence cries. The whipcrack of airbursts hovered in her ears even when the forest was still. And then they found them. A handful of German survivors, frostbitten and dazed, stumbling from the trees. One raised trembling hands. Another clutched a wound leaking through frozen cloth. The Americans leveled rifles instantly, voices sharp. "Don't shoot," one of the younger soldiers barked. "They're giving up." For a moment the line of rifles didn't waver. Evelyn held her breath. She saw boys in uniform, not monsters. Saw how thin their cheeks were, how their hands shook more from cold than fear. Finally the captain motioned down. "Take them prisoners." Relief washed through her. Not mercy exactly, but something close enough. The Germans collapsed onto their knees, coughing in the snow. One of them, barely more than a teenager, lifted his eyes toward Evelyn as though sensing her. His stare pierced her in a way she couldn't name. Not accusation, not gratitude, just recognition. She looked away quickly. The column pressed on, leaving prisoners under guard. Evelyn's breath felt heavier now, thick in her chest. Each step forward carried the weight of eyes that would follow her forever. By midday they reached another rise overlooking a valley. Smoke rose in thin threads from scattered barns. Tracks marred the snow where armor had pushed days earlier. Evelyn crouched, pulling her binoculars up, sweeping across the frozen expanse. Movement, German stragglers again. Not many. 15, maybe 20, setting up in the ruins of a farmhouse. Desperate, cold, clinging to walls that barely stood. She marked their position, her pencil scratching across the paper. "Report it," the captain ordered. Her throat tightened. "They're not organized, barely standing." "Orders, Hayes." She hesitated. The captain's eyes snapped to hers, sharp. "Your job is to observe, not to judge." The words cut deeper than intended. She nodded slowly, passed the coordinates to radio. Minutes later the sky cracked again. Airbursts shredded the ruins. The farmhouse disintegrated in clouds of smoke and snow. Through her lenses, Evelyn saw figures crumple, vanish. One staggered into the open, arms flailing, before collapsing into stillness. Her hands shook so badly, she dropped the binoculars. The men cheered. She stared at the snow. That night in the dark of another borrowed barn, she sat alone, staring at her notebook. Every line she had written was clean, precise, clinical. But when she closed her eyes, the lines blurred into faces, into eyes that wouldn't leave her. She thought of her father again, how he'd once told her, "Truth is heavier than silence, but silence kills slower." She wondered if he had ever been wrong. The barn creaked in the wind. Rats scurried in the rafters. She pressed her palms to her temples, rocking slightly. If she broke silence, if she told these men the truth, that their weapons were something entirely new, something the enemy could not fight, what would it change? Nothing. The shells would still fall. The Germans would still die. But maybe, just maybe, someone would stop calling it beautiful. She bit her lip until she tasted blood. Outside, the night echoed with distant thunder, another battery firing somewhere down the line. Somewhere, more men ducked into foxholes, believing they were safe. Somewhere, more were learning the new truth too late. And Evelyn lay awake, asking the question she dared not voice aloud. If survival itself had become obsolete, what was left for the living? What happens when the enemy looks you in the eye and doesn't look like the enemy at all? Snow was falling again, thick and slow, muffling the world in a hush that felt cruel after so much fire. Evelyn trudged through drifts behind the captain's column, her legs heavy, her thoughts heavier. The men muttered in low voices, cursing the cold, the rations, the endless push. She stayed silent, her breath short in the freezing air. They reached the edge of another forest clearing by late afternoon. A farmhouse stood ahead, collapsed roof, walls half gone. The captain raised his fist, halting the column. "Scouts," he whispered. Two men slipped forward. Evelyn crouched with the rest, clutching her binoculars. She scanned the tree line, the wreckage, the churned snow. Nothing. No movement. But her chest prickled with unease. The scouts crept closer. Then shouts, gunfire cracked. A blur of figures burst from the farmhouse ruins. Germans. Not many, half a squad maybe. Desperate, ragged, but still armed. The captain barked orders, rifles snapped up. Fire erupted in sharp bursts. Evelyn hit the snow, heart hammering, the cold biting through her uniform. She forced herself to raise her binoculars. Through the glass she saw them, the Germans, gaunt and hollow-eyed, scrambling for cover. One fired wildly, another dragged a comrade whose leg left a dark trail across the snow. They weren't organized. They weren't prepared. They were simply trying to live another hour. The firefight lasted less than 2 minutes. Most of the Germans fell where they stood. Two ran, disappearing into the trees. One remained sprawled in the snow but still breathing, his rifle flung aside. The captain gestured, "Take him alive." A pair of Americans moved forward cautiously, rifles ready. Evelyn followed without thinking, her boots crunching softly. She told herself it was duty, but part of her knew it was something else, an invisible pull. The survivor was young, barely older than her students back home. His face was pale, lips trembling from cold and pain. When he saw her among the soldiers, his eyes widened. Confusion flickered, then recognition, not of her but of her humanity. Evelyn froze. For a heartbeat the war peeled away. He was just a boy lying in snow, staring at her like she might be the last human face he'd ever see. The sergeant cursed, kicking the German's rifle farther away. He won't last long, should have finished the job. Orders were clear, the captain snapped, "Prisoner." Evelyn knelt before she could stop herself. The boy's breath rattled. His hand twitched as if reaching for something, anything. She hesitated, then pulled her glove off and pressed her bare hand against his. Warmth leached instantly into the snow. His grip was weak, but it was there. The sergeant scowled. "Don't waste your pity, Hayes. He'd put a bullet in you if he had the chance." Would he? Evelyn wasn't sure. His eyes were glazed with pain, not hatred. They seemed to ask her a question she couldn't answer. Her throat tightened. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words died. Silence again. The medics arrived, lifting him roughly onto a stretcher. Evelyn stood back, her empty hand burning with cold. That night around a fire in another ruined farmhouse, the men retold the skirmish like a hunting story. "Damn Krauts thought they could hold out in a barn," one chuckled. "Not against us. Not today." Evelyn stayed apart, staring into the flames. The boy's eyes lingered in her mind. They weren't the eyes of an enemy. They weren't even the eyes of a soldier. They were the eyes of someone who hadn't asked for this war, who had been dragged into it by uniforms, flags, commands, just like her. She thought of speaking up, telling them what she knew, confessing that this war was no longer about men and rifles, but about machines and circuits hidden inside shells. That the boy in the snow was already obsolete before he picked up his weapon. But she stayed silent, because silence was survival. When the fire burned low, she slipped outside alone. Snowflakes drifted through the dark, catching moonlight. She tilted her head back, letting the cold sting her skin. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled again. She flinched. Her mind returned to her father's voice, low and steady. "Sometimes, Evelyn, the hardest battles are the ones where no one knows you're fighting." She wondered if he'd still believe that, if he knew the silence she was drowning in. Her boots crunched softly as she walked farther into the trees. The world was quiet now, too quiet. She closed her eyes. For a moment she imagined what it would feel like to scream, to let it all out, the truth, the guilt, the rage. To tell the world about the weapon that erased Foxholes, erased rules, erased humanity. But the scream never came. Only her breath in the cold and the echo of whipcracks above an endless forest. And in that silence, she asked herself the question she feared most. What if the war inside her would never end, no matter who won? How do you run from a sky that wants you dead? It began with the sound, the sharp, flat crack she knew too well. Evelyn was crouched with the others in a tree line, waiting for the order to advance across an open stretch of snow. Scouts had reported German movement beyond the far ridge. The men whispered nervously, shifting on numb legs. She pretended to adjust her binoculars, but really she was steadying her breath. The first salvo screamed overhead. Instinct drove the men down foxholes, depressions, anything that looked like cover. Evelyn froze. She knew better. She knew the air would split 30 feet above, that the earth was no longer sanctuary. Her voice caught in her throat. She wanted to shout, "Don't dig in, don't crouch, spread out, move." But the words never came. The shells cracked open the air. Shrapnel scythed downward, chewing bark, shredding branches, thudding into flesh. The forest erupted in screams. A soldier 2 feet from her convulsed as fragments tore into his shoulder. Another collapsed face first into snow, blood spreading red beneath the white. Evelyn dove sideways, not down, sprinting toward a cluster of rocks. Her legs burned. Every step felt stolen. Behind her, the sky kept cracking. She stumbled, fell, scrambled back up. The weight of her satchel nearly pulled her sideways. She slammed herself against stone as shrapnel rattled across the surface. She pressed her face into the freezing ground, heart hammering. Breath came in ragged bursts. She could smell gunpowder, blood, the acrid smoke of shattered wood. Around her, men cried out. Some begged, some cursed, some were silent. She squeezed her eyes shut. This was the moment she had feared since the first day she'd seen those tests back home. The moment when the weapon wasn't a secret file or a distant burst, but the air above her head. The barrage lasted less than 5 minutes. It felt like a lifetime. When it ended, the silence roared. Evelyn lifted her head slowly. Snow drifted from torn branches. Smoke clung low, curling like fingers. Bodies dotted the ground, some moving, most not. She pulled herself up, her legs trembling. The captain staggered toward her, blood streaking his sleeve. "Hayes, you all right?" She nodded, voice gone. "Medic," he bellowed, then dropped into the snow beside a man whose chest no longer rose. Evelyn looked around at what was left. Half the squad gone. Survivors blinking in shock, ears ringing, hands trembling as they checked their own bodies for holes they couldn't feel yet. She saw fear in their faces, the kind that didn't fade. One soldier caught her eye. Private Miller, 19, freckles still visible through the soot. He stared at her with something close to desperation. What the hell was that? They're detonating in the air now, above us. I thought," he broke off, swallowing. "Foxholes are supposed to." He didn't finish. His voice cracked. Evelyn opened her mouth, closed it again. What could she say? That she'd known. That she had watched this weapon tested months ago and said nothing. That even their instincts, earned in blood and terror, were useless now. She pressed her lips together. Silence again, always silence. "God help us," Miller whispered, staring at the sky like it had betrayed him. The survivors regrouped shakily. Orders came to move out, to push toward the ridge despite losses. The captain barked commands, voice raw. The men obeyed, though their steps dragged. Their eyes darted upward every few seconds. Evelyn followed. Each stride felt like penance. By late afternoon, they reached a depression where trees thinned. The captain ordered a halt. Medics tended the wounded, their bandages already red. The dead were left under snow-shrouded branches, their names muttered quickly before the column pressed forward. Evelyn sat apart, her notebook open but blank. For the first time, she couldn't bring herself to write. Numbers meant nothing now. She had been inside the storm. She had felt its teeth. Her hands shook as she lit a small match, cupping it against the wind. She held it to the page. For a heartbeat, she imagined burning the whole notebook, the coordinates, the tallies, the neat accounting of lives erased. Fire licking across paper, taking silence with it. The flame guttered out. The page remained. She pressed her palms to her eyes. Night fell heavy. They bivouacked in another ruined farmhouse. The men huddled in corners, too tired to talk. No laughter tonight. Only the occasional cough, the rustle of someone shifting in pain. Evelyn lay on the floor, staring at rafters where shadows swayed. Her body ached. Her ears still rang. She thought of Miller's eyes, wide with betrayal. She thought of her own silence, heavier now than ever. She remembered the German boy's hand in hers, weak but human. She remembered her father's words about truth and silence. She remembered the whipcrack of air above her, the realization that she was just as fragile, just as expendable, as the men she watched die. She turned her face into her arm and let the tears come. Quiet, always quiet. When dawn broke, the orders came again. Move, always move. The war didn't stop for grief. As she slung her satchel over her shoulder, she felt the question rising again, sharper now, impossible to bury. If survival itself was obsolete, then what was the point of surviving at all? Why did she stop walking when everyone else kept moving? The column pressed on through the forest, boots crunching in rhythm, rifles low. Snow fell in thin veils, muffling the sound of war into something strangely fragile. Evelyn lagged a step behind, her mind distant, her chest heavy. She had seen too much now. Not just from a distance, not through glass, not with numbers neat on a page. She had been under it. She had felt the storm crack above her, had heard the fragments tear the world into pieces. And though she lived, something inside her had not walked away from that clearing. She thought of Miller again, his eyes wide, his voice cracking as he realized the rules had changed. She thought of the boy whose hand she had held as life slipped away. She thought of the ravine filled with shrapnel and silence. The weight was too much. Her legs slowed. Her satchel dragged. For a moment she stood still as the men trudged past her, lost in their own exhaustion. "Hayes," the captain barked, glancing back. "Keep up." She nodded quickly, forcing herself forward. But inside she knew she couldn't keep this up much longer. By midday they reached another rise overlooking a small Belgian village, stone cottages huddled against the cold, roofs sagging under snow. Smoke rose faintly from chimneys. Civilian or soldier, no one could tell. The captain ordered a halt, scouts spread out. Evelyn crouched low, binoculars sweeping. She saw movement between cottages, shadows slipping behind walls. German stragglers again, fewer than a dozen. Wounded, weary, but still armed. "Report," the captain said. Evelyn hesitated. She could mark the grid past the coordinates, call in another storm. She could watch another handful of men vanish in fire. It would be efficient, clean, the kind of victory the brass liked. But she couldn't forget the boy's hand in hers. She couldn't forget Miller's voice. Her pencil hovered. "Hayes," the captain pressed, impatience sharp. She lowered the pencil slowly. "They're not strong, just a few. Looks like they're moving out. We could bypass them." The captain's eyes narrowed. "Bypass?" "Yes, sir." She forced her voice steady. "Save shells for stronger positions. These men won't hold long." For a heartbeat, silence hung heavy. The captain studied her, his face unreadable. Then he grunted. "Fine, bypass, move on." Evelyn exhaled slowly, relief washing through her. She had lied. For the first time she had bent the truth in her log. They moved around the village, snow crunching softly. Evelyn's heart pounded the whole time, half expecting the captain to call her out, half expecting shells to fall anyway. But nothing came. They passed through the trees, leaving the cottages behind, and the storm did not follow. She walked on in silence, the first spark of something flickering inside her. Not victory, not pride, something smaller, something fragile. Maybe mercy. That night, camped in another ruined barn, she sat apart from the men as usual. Her hands shook as she opened her notebook. She stared at the blank page, the pencil hovering. She had always filled it with coordinates, tallies, cold records. Tonight she wrote only one line, small and quick. "I lied to save them." Her hand trembled as she read it back. The words felt dangerous, but also alive. She tucked the notebook away quickly when footsteps approached. Miller. He crouched beside her, his face pale in the lantern glow. "You knew," he whispered. Her heart jolted. "What?" "You knew those shells weren't normal, the way they hit, the way they—" He trailed off, swallowing hard. "I saw your face, you weren't surprised." Evelyn's breath caught. She stared at him, words trapped in her throat. "I'm not stupid," he said softly. "You know something we don't, and you're not telling us." The barn creaked in the wind. Evelyn's pulse thudded in her ears. She should deny it, laugh it off, say he was imagining things. But when she opened her mouth, nothing came. Miller studied her for a long moment, then shook his head. "Whatever it is, it's killing you more than it's killing us." He stood, leaving her in the shadows with her silence. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her heart hammer. The truth was clawing its way out now. Someone had seen through her. She pulled the notebook out again, staring at the line she had written. "I lied to save them." Her father's words echoed again, heavy as ever. Truth is heavier than silence, but silence kills slower. For the first time, she wondered which weight she would carry longer. Outside, distant artillery cracked again, faint against the night. Evelyn flinched at the sound. But this time, for the first time, she wasn't only afraid of the shells. She was afraid of herself, afraid of what she might do next. How long could she carry silence before it carried her? The march resumed at dawn. The forest glowed pale blue under snow. Evelyn trudged with the others, her satchel biting into her shoulder, her mind replaying the night before. Miller's words wouldn't leave her. "Whatever it is, it's killing you more than it's killing us." He was right. Every step, every crack of artillery in the distance felt heavier now. By midday they reached another ridge. Below, a frozen road twisted between fields, scattered with wrecks, burned trucks, broken sleds, horses frozen stiff in their traces. The captain scanned with binoculars. "Enemy movement, south side. Haze confirm." Evelyn raised her glass. Shapes moved among the wrecks, German soldiers, a full platoon this time, not stragglers, not boys in cottages. Armed, dug in behind twisted metal. She swallowed hard. The captain waited. "Well." She hesitated. Her pencil hovered over the grid. This was different. This wasn't a handful she could spare with a lie. This was a fighting force. If she withheld the truth now, it could cost American lives. Her throat tightened. She forced herself to write, coordinates, numbers, precision. She handed it off. Minutes later, the sky cracked again. Whip after whip. Shells bursting overhead, showering fire across the frozen road. Evelyn's stomach knotted. Through her binoculars she saw them, men diving, men running, men falling. The wrecks became coffins. Smoke curled in the white air. The captain exhaled with satisfaction. "That's how it's done." But Evelyn lowered the glass, her vision blurring. She had told the truth this time, and it had killed them. The squad advanced cautiously, weapons raised. Survivors crawled from the wrecks, groaning. Some tried to fight, most didn't. The Americans cleared the field with bursts of rifle fire. Evelyn trailed behind, notebook open, recording mechanically. Until she saw him. Miller, his rifle aimed at a wounded German slumped against a wheel. The boy raised trembling hands. His helmet was gone, his hair matted with blood. He couldn't have been older than 18. "Don't move," Miller hissed, finger on the trigger. Evelyn's chest clenched. She stepped forward. "Private, stop." He glanced back, eyes wild. "Orders are clear. We don't leave stragglers armed." "He's finished," Evelyn said, her voice firmer than she felt. "Look at him, he's no threat." Miller's jaw tightened. His rifle didn't waver. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw more than fear. She saw accusation. "You knew. You've always known." The moment stretched. The boy whimpered. Evelyn's breath quickened. She wanted to reach out, to pull the barrel down, to shout the truth she had swallowed for months. But then a shot cracked. Not hers, not Miller's. Another soldier fired, cutting the boy down. The body slumped sideways into the snow. Miller lowered his rifle slowly, his face pale. He looked at Evelyn again, and this time his eyes burned. "Say it," he whispered hoarsely. "Say what you know." Evelyn's lips parted. The words pressed against her throat, desperate to escape. "The shells, the fuse, the reason Foxholes no longer save you, the reason none of us are safe." But the captain's voice cut in. "Move out, clear the next line." The chance slipped away. Evelyn closed her mouth. Silence again. They marched on. Miller walked ahead of her now, shoulders stiff, never glancing back. The distance between them was worse than any storm. That night they camped in another ruined barn, the walls groaning in the wind. The men slumped into exhausted sleep. Evelyn sat apart, staring at her notebook. She read the lines she had written days ago. "I lied to save them." She wanted to add more. "I told the truth today, and it killed them anyway." But she couldn't move her hand. She closed her eyes, head sinking into her arms. In the dark, the whipcracks still echoed. The German boy's eyes still stared. Miller's voice still whispered, "Say it." And she knew, sooner or later she would. Because silence was no longer slower. It was killing her now. What happens when silence can no longer protect you? The squad was moving again before dawn, their boots grinding ice, their shadows long in the pale moonlight. Evelyn followed at the rear, her satchel heavy, her throat raw from words she had never spoken. Miller walked ahead of her, stiff and silent, his back turned like a door slammed shut. She had thought she could survive this war by obeying, by staying quiet, by writing numbers while others pulled triggers. But every day, every shell burst, the silence cut deeper than shrapnel. By mid-morning they reached another ridge. Below stretched a German supply column, horses straining against carts, men stumbling with frostbitten hands. Not soldiers anymore, just bodies trying to move. The captain raised his binoculars. Perfect target, haze. Evelyn's chest froze. She lifted her glass, saw them clearly. A line of men with hollow cheeks, too thin to fight, too tired to run. Some wore bandages, some carried nothing but their own shadows. She lowered the binoculars, her pencil hovered. The captain's eyes bored into her. Coordinates. She couldn't breathe. If she gave the grid, the shells would come. The whipcracks would tear the sky open. Those men would vanish like snow under fire. Her hands shook. "Hayes," the captain snapped, "now." And then Miller's voice cut through the cold. "Sir." The captain turned. Miller's face was pale but steady. "With respect, we don't need artillery for that. They're finished. We can bypass." The captain scowled. "We don't leave targets alive." "They're not a target," Miller said. His eyes flicked briefly toward Evelyn. "They're just men." The silence stretched. The other soldiers shifted uneasily, their breaths hanging in the air. Evelyn's heart pounded. Finally she spoke. Her voice shook, but the words came. "He's right, we should bypass. The shells," she stopped herself, throat tight. "The shells are wasted here." The captain's jaw clenched. For a moment Evelyn thought he would have her arrested, dragged away, silenced in truth. But then he cursed under his breath and waved his hand. "Fine. Bypass. Move." Relief swept the squad like wind through trees. They moved on, skirting the column. Evelyn's legs trembled with every step. For the first time her silence had cracked. That night, huddled in another abandoned farmhouse, Miller sat beside her. He didn't speak at first, just sat, staring into the flicker of the lantern. Finally he said, "You spoke." Evelyn swallowed. "Not enough." Miller looked at her, his young face hard but not unkind. "Whatever secret you're carrying, it's eating you alive. I don't need to know it, but I need you to stop dying inside it." Her eyes burned. She looked down at her notebook. She had written so many numbers, so many coordinates. Tonight she wrote nothing. She closed it slowly. The night stretched quiet. Wind rattled the shutters. She lay awake, listening to the men breathe, to the distant thunder of another battery. And she knew the war outside would end someday, but the war inside her would not. She thought of the German boy's hand in hers. She thought of Miller's cracked voice, begging for truth. She thought of the whipcracks in the sky, the silence after. When dawn came, she rose before the others. She walked outside into the snow, the horizon glowing faint with first light. The air was cold, sharp, clean. She closed her eyes and let the silence settle. For the first time, it didn't crush her, it carried her. Because she understood now, silence wasn't survival, silence wasn't protection, silence was choice. And sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. She pulled her coat tighter, turned back toward the farmhouse. Another day waited, another march, another battle. But she walked lighter now, not because the war was easier, but because she had chosen how she would carry it. The thunder would always follow, the sky would always crack, but Evelyn Hayes had found her own way to answer it. And in the frozen fields of Belgium, among foxholes that no longer promised safety, she learned the final truth of war. That sometimes survival isn't about living through the storm. It's about living with what the storm leaves behind.